unfortunately, the issue around dealing with human waste and such as that. Bill 64 will ensure that the department uses funds from the public land camping pass fees to improve the overall visitor experience through infrastructure upgrades, education, enforcement, public safety, and environmental and waste management. And for those who are concerned about these fees going into general revenue and not being able to sort out how the funds have been used, I'm pretty sure that most households in Alberta understand that you put your money into a main bank account, and then from that bank account you buy groceries and you pay your mortgage and you do this and you do that. And at the end of the month you can look and say, well, this much of the money went to this much of the money went to this much of the money went to this, and this much of the money went to that. You also know that money going into your account came from person A's employment, person B's employment, Judy's stipend for whatever. You know where the money came from, you know where the money's going. I don't think it's that hard to actually track it. So I'm super unconcerned for this, these fees to be somehow lost. We need to understand that we're going to make sure that our lands are properly taken care of. That's what Albertans value. That's what they want. That's why they wanted this fee in the first place. And so that's what will happen. We expect net revenue from the public land camping pass to reach $1.7 million in the first year, and with increasing compliance in years following at $2.7 million per year. This will help protect our great outdoors and allow Albertans to have the experience they deserve when they choose to get camping. Madam Speaker, I'm proud to support this bill, and I'm very appreciative of all the hard work that has been put in to create it. It's an important piece of legislation which I hope we can all get behind. Our camping areas are part of what makes this province so great, and we need to do what we can to maintain them. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to join debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. Sorry, my ears are not plugged. My face is, but I couldn't quite hear exactly what you said. Thanks for the opportunity to say a few words around Bill 64, this Public Lands Amendment Act. And, this is we're just seeing this in the last 24 hours or so. And so I think that I would reflect my colleagues' observations and comments on this mostly in the form of questions, because there seems to be quite a lot of details that need to be sorted out in regards to this bill, and certainly I think that my questions and others will reflect I think what a lot of Albertans are wondering about as well. And again, perhaps it wasn't the first thing I was going to talk about, but the Honourable Member just previous spoke about accountability and about budgeting and having the monies collected from this new user fee for for public land, and how that would be brought into the provincial coffers. And what's important to understand, and I think all of us need perhaps a bit of a reminder about this, is that we build budgets here in this different ministries in the provincial legislature in order to be accountable to the monies and where they come from and where they go. And so this notion that you just take a park fee, a user fee for public land, and you drop it into general revenues without having a legal requirement to account for that money is not responsible at first glance, and probably at second glance and third glance too. And I remember very specifically the federal government getting into a lot of trouble around this, around national park fees, right? Where you bought your national park pass for the day or for the season, and then it started to get out that the federal government was just putting it into general revenues. You thought you were buying that pass to pay for the picnic tables and the wardens and the road and the interpretive sites and all of that. But in fact, the money was just going into general revenues, right? And I fear that we're setting up a very similar version of this here in the province by having a user fee charged to use on public land, on Crown land, and then just dropping it into general revenues. I'm very suspicious about that. And I know that anyone who has spoken favorably or in vague sympathy of this notion of having more money invested into public lands and people using and camping on public lands is doing it on the premise that that money and that money needs to be put in there for security, for sanitation, for garbage collection, for enforcement of other statutes that apply to being in the bush, right? And protecting the animals and the flora and the fauna that are there. And so without that basic foundation built into Bill 64, I would find, I'm skeptical from the beginning because, I like to camp and random camp is just as much as anybody, and one of the issues that I've had over the years around using Crown land for random camping is that people are not necessarily practicing safe practices when using Crown land. And, you want to be out there, but you want to be safe. You want to make sure that others are safe as well in regards to human hygiene, in regards to activities with motor vehicles, with firearms, and so forth, and fires as well. And so, there's a certain standard that people, I think, would expect, especially if they're paying a $30 fee or a $20 fee for 3 days per person, by the way, right, to use that public land. So that's not an unimportant part of this, I think, the question around this bill, and I think it needs to be explored much, much further. Another issue that I would like to just to discuss briefly here is around enforcement, right? Because if you create a new law where people need to spend the $20 or the $30 per person to utilize the public land, that there's got to be a mechanism by which you can ensure that people are in fact following that rule. Because if it's just written on paper and there's nothing there to enforce that, then you probably are only going to be collecting a fraction. Some people will dutifully pay, and other people won't. And so, again, when you set up something like this, you've got to make sure that you have explicitly a mechanism by which we are demonstrating enforcement and demonstrating equity in that enforcement, so that some people are paying, some people aren't, and so forth. That's a problem. Another issue, I think, that this government needs to face, and of course we're here to give free advice because that's who we are as the official opposition, is the question of dealing with the credibility or the lack of credibility that this UCP government has around their governance and stewardship of parks in general. And we saw a huge falderal over the last year in regards to a list of parks that were going to be delisted, a list of places that would be downgraded. And I mean, I don't have to tell you what happened, right? The public outcry was significant, and this government had to backtrack. Now, once you do that once, or you do that twice, people go, well, we're not going to get fooled again, right? We will, here they are with another public land thing that talks about camping, talks about the recreation that I like to enjoy and with my family and so forth. What's the catch this time, right? What are they doing that's going to make it more expensive, that's going to reduce access, that's going to reduce all of those other, and safety and all of the other things that I mentioned before. So, that whole saga around provincial campsites and provincial parks and so forth really has focused the attention of Albertans around this valuable resource that we all own together. And I've heard it time and time again, and it's the old thing of talking outside two sides of your mouth, right? We can't see people doing that literally with these masks on, but here, I'll give you an example, right? Where somebody will say I'm sure it was in the debate last night, right? Where someone would say, well, I don't have to pay, why should I be paying twice? It's not as though something is free, because I'm paying it through my taxes, right? And that's part of what I have together is the thing that I own together, and I pay as an Alberta citizen. Well, I think public land probably falls into that category on the most fundamental, basic sort of way. It is Crown land that we all own together, right? Collectively. And this notion that, oh, well, you know, nothing's for free, right? And you should pay your way and all that kind of thing. Well, we do pay. We pay together for the ownership and the stewardship of the land that we have as public land, as Crown land here in the province of Alberta, right? So you put a user fee on top of that, and it's like you're double charging for the thing that you already paid for in the first place as a citizen and a taxpayer here in the province of Alberta. And so, you know, that doublespeak where we hear that's being said on one side of our mouths on some issues and then other side of the mouth on other issues, you know, people don't like that. You know, they see through it, and I don't know. Like I'm really wondering. Like I'm looking at social media here with this newfound fee that people are going to be expected to pay. Starting on June 1st, is that what I just heard? Okay, holy smokes, that's just coming right around the corner, right? And, you know, people are getting ready, they're making their plans to go camping. I know that people have booked their provincial campsites already. It's a very popular thing to do. You know, what exactly is the mechanism of how this is going to hit the ground to start charging, to get people into the regular idea of paying these fees and the services they might expect as a result of paying these fees, all in 6 weeks? I wonder. I really do wonder about that, you know? And people are going to wonder where they have to pay, how they're going to pay, what part of Alberta are they going to have to pay. I mean, I heard some vague sort of sketch of what encompasses the eastern slopes as defined by Bill 64. But you better get that out to the rest of the people in Alberta because, I mean, you know, my feeling is this, right? Yeah, the eastern slopes, the water in Alberta, literally the western boundary of our province is defined by the Continental Divide, right? And so all of the province, pretty much up to Grand Prairie and Van North, is the eastern slopes. That's which way the water goes, right? And so how far does that extend towards the east? That's the $30 question for paying those fees, right? You know, quite literally. You know, if I'm choosing to canoe in the eastern part of Alberta, like, I mean, where's that point where, you know, the water turns from, or the shoreline turns from $30 for camping and then goes to free camping, you know? I think that's a fair question. I'm planning a canoe trip right now. I would like to know where I'm going to have to pay this thing and what part of the province am I meant to pay it if I do have to pay it all. That's another question right there. Is the provincial crown land, does that extend to the edges of waterways, right? You know, I plan a canoe trip and then off I go. I camp on the side of the below the high water mark, right? Is that a place where you have to pay this $30 or $20 for 3 days or whatever as a camping fee? We need to get all of those details out in the next 6 weeks, have that mechanism in place, and you know, hope that Albertans don't react negatively to this. And I must say, I mean, on first blush, I am definitely reacting negatively to this because first and foremost, I think it's very important that we have a way, an affordable way by which people can recreate close to their homes here in the province of Alberta. I represent a constituency, by and large, where their primary source of recreation is to go somewhere within a few hundred kilometers of Edmonton, right? They might go camping for the weekend at a local lake. They might head off into, you know, along the forestry trunk line and do some fishing and some random camping, right, or canoeing or whatever. But it's the affordable way by which you can recreate in this province in the summer with your family, or in the winter too. This idea of putting a monetizing crown land, public land, categorically makes me very critical about this. Also in this bill, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'd be happy to hear the minister tell us the details of this, but this bill does not preclude the possibility of having day use charges for that use of that same public land here in the province of Alberta. We've already seen that starting to happen in places like the Kananaskis and skiing, cross-country ski trails that are being monetized somehow. And, you know, this notion that to wander off into the woods for an afternoon with your family on public provincial land, and you somehow are being handed a bill for that at the end of your walk, Again, I think it goes against the basic notion of the common good. It goes against the notion of the public good. And, you know, again, I fear that Bill 64, charging for camping on public land, again, without any guarantees of some added service of safety and sanitation and care and stewardship directed to that fee, I'm deeply skeptical on that as well. So, I mean, those are my initial thoughts around this, this bill. I know that lots of Albertans are listening and interested. I could see, you know, driving around my neighborhood and I see all the tent trailers and whatnot and canoes in people's backyards, right? I mean, this is a direct thing that affects the choices that people are going to make in the next 6 weeks. We have to make sure that we have answers to those questions. You have to have justification for those questions. And quite frankly, at this juncture, I believe myself and the opposition are deeply skeptical of the nature and the structure and the intention of this bill. Thank you.
Well, member, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, the honourable member for Drayton Valley, Devon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a privilege to rise today to speak to Bill 64, the Public Lands Amendments Act. You know, sometimes you don't really realize that you're significantly different from other peoples in the world, that Albertans actually have a culture, that we're actually different from people around the rest of this world, until you get a new fresh set of eyes that come in. And every once in a while we get family that comes over from Europe or from England, and sometimes we get a family that comes from down east, and you don't really realize just how different Albertans are and our culture is until you see Alberta through their eyes. And I can remember walking around my hometown in Drayton, right where I live, in Drayton Valley, and we had some family from England over, and they were absolutely amazed that it seemed like in every single house in Drayton Valley, there was some form of a camper, some form of a mobile home, some form of an ATV, some form of vehicle that would help them to get out into nature and into the back country where Drayton Valley is on the edge of. And they were just absolutely astounded that something that they just didn't do was such a natural part of the life of the Albertans that I live with on a daily basis. And for all of us that have grown up in Alberta and in this absolutely gorgeous province, it's just a part of who we are. I know that the honourable member from Northwest Edmonton often talks about going canoeing out in my neck of the woods in the Drayton Valley area on the North Saskatchewan. And our neck of the woods. And, well, we just might let you, I might share it with you for a little bit here. And, you know, we just grow up. I can remember being in junior high and taking the Hunter Education Program. For some of you, I don't know, I believe it's still available, but it was done through our junior high school in Edmonton, at Hillcrest Junior High School. And being taken out, and we were random camping in the middle of winter. And we must be pretty either silly or they must have been very brave teachers or something, because it was literally 30 below. And they're taking a bunch of junior high kids out to go random camping beside a lake. And I can remember that it was so cold that I learned a very valuable lesson. The first thing you do when you're winter camping is start a fire. We started to try to build our lean-to and our shelter, and realized very quickly that it got very, very cold. And we eventually got our fire started, but not before we were, you know, our fingers were numb, and I realized that when I picked up my knife by the blade, that it can actually burn. It could get so cold. I can remember one of our kids setting his sleeping bag on fire. At 30 below, that's actually an important thing you've got to deal with. And I can remember that when we were finished our random camping after being there for 3 days, and we went back to the buses, not one of the buses would start, and we had to start a small fire underneath each of the engines to warm the oil up and to get the engines warm enough to be able to turn over. That's life in Alberta. We are used to being outside, we're used to being in nature, and we're used to being taking advantage of the glorious opportunities that we have on the eastern slopes. I know that when I was growing up, our family would go down those forestry trunk roads, camping, almost every summer. Well, not every summer, but a lot of the summers. And those family vacations, those memories stick with you. I can remember taking my own kids down to Lake Abraham and going hiking. Just even this past fall, my wife and I went down to Lake. It was actually this spring. Went down to Lake Abraham. It was so windy there, we almost got blown off our feet. I mean, the gusting wind was absolutely. Someday I'll show you the pictures there, David, and you can see just what it was like. I remember going camping near Crescent Falls before there was really much of a road going into Crescent Falls. My car breaking down, having to try to fix it in the middle of the bush. That's just who we are as Albertans. We enjoy the fact that we live near some of the best scenery anywhere in the world. My son is presently living in Montreal and has a young lady in his life, and she came out to visit us here a couple years ago. She'd never seen the Rocky Mountains. We often take it for granted. So what does this have to do with the Public Lands Amendment Act? Well, I'm trying to show you here is that for us in Alberta, having access to those public lands is absolutely critically important to who we are. And random camping is when you're heading into the woods and you're camping in a non-designated area on public lands. And for many, this has more of an authentic camping feel to it than going to a national park where the amenities are there and the roads are there and the parking sites are there. You know, the rules for random, and there are rules for random camping. You know, you can't be doing it within 1 kilometer of a provincial or national park. You're encouraged to minimize your impact. And you cannot camp on vegetation. You must find a place with minimal vegetation, sand and gravel. You're encouraged to use compact stoves, camping stoves, and it's not that you can't have a fire, but you're trying to minimize your scars on the land. I can remember when I would be random camping as a university student and later on in life, you know, you always looked around the camping site and said, did you leave it cleaner than when you got there? And, you know, yeah, you could build a proper fire pit, but it had to be a proper fire pit. And garbage had to be, if you tracked it in, you tracked it out. And Albertans understand that. Most Albertans understand that. That, you know, the waterways that we have to be protected, have to be taken care of. And so there are rules in place for the protection of our back country. Now, sometimes, sadly, this doesn't happen. And it's partly why we need to have this bill. You know, many Albertans, the people who horseback ride into the backcountry, who have ATVs, who hike, these are the people that are the most disappointed when they realize that the guidelines have not been followed. And it's these Albertans and it's the clubs that they belong to that have actually lobbied for Bill 64. You know, it was a few years ago that the previous government brought in some rules and regulations to try to deal with the backcountry that were very unpopular because they were perceived by the people that use the backcountry as trying to freeze them out of the backcountry and not allowing them to go into that backcountry. They didn't believe that there'd been proper consultation. And this legislation, though, is the result of a long period of consultation with these stakeholders, and it's actually a reflection of what these stakeholders have asked for. Let me give you just a couple of them. When we did our consultations and we asked for their opinions about this legislation, one of the ones that I remember working with, and I'll get Garrett Schmidt, the president of the Alberta Off-Highways Vehicle Association, to speak to this, get his name on record. He's quoted as saying, "The Alberta Off-Highway Vehicle Association has long advocated for user funding models that invest back into the activities that Albertans enjoy, to support meaningful and managed recreation that ensures the sustainability both of the activity and our environment." Now, I know Garrett, and I know many of the people that every weekend in the summer take off to go off into the back country and are in using their ATVs or their horses or just hiking. And, you know, they are the ones that care the most about making sure that that their activities are being done in an environmentally responsible way. And it's them and their clubs that are insistent that when they use the back country, that there is a process and that there are funds for making sure that the trails are kept up, that the waterways that they're going over are not being disrupted, that the lands that they're using are going to be there for their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. They're the ones that truly, really understand just how important this piece of legislation really is. He goes on. "Some of our members' clubs and other groups volunteer to maintain some of the random camping and staging areas on public lands, and we are glad to see this government's commitment to implementing and supporting solutions that ensure future generations' ability to enjoy." Madam Speaker, I've met with some of these clubs. I've gone into the back country with some of these clubs. I've taken some of these ATV trails. I've been on the backs of horses and gone into the Sundre area. Matter of fact, I think one of the things that I'll take to my grave, one of the memories that I will take to my grave, is coming up over a ridge just as the sun is beginning to go down and seeing a herd of about 300 to 400 elk grazing on a high alpine pasture. I would never have had the opportunity to see that part of nature and to see something that very few people will ever get a chance to see that. And we have that opportunity in Alberta, but we need to make sure that when we have those opportunities, that we're maintaining the trails and that the clubs and the people that are using this have the resources that they need through this piece of legislation to be able to make sure that we can enjoy while maintaining the environment so that our future generations will continue to be able to have those kinds of experiences. It's agreed by many, Madam Speaker, that that means that you're going to have some enforcement in order to be able to maintain the rules and the regulations. The people and the clubs that use the eastern slopes and the backcountry are actually asking for this legislation so that there is a capacity to be able to fund and enforce the environmental regulations and the backwoods camping regulations, so that we can make sure that that is continuing to be there for generations to come. And in Alberta, we have traditionally and historically adopted a user pay system. And this fits in with that tradition. Now, critics of the bill, and we've heard some of that today, they would say that we're nickel and diming families' pocketbooks. But it's these fees that are actually very reasonable. We're looking at a proposed $20 per person pass for 3 nights, or a $30 per person pass for an entire year. And in just about anybody's pocketbook, we can see that is affordable. And what's probably most important is what it's going to ensure is that when you do go out into that back country, that it's actually an experience that you will be able to enjoy. because we've had the capacity to enforce, to pick up the garbage, to maintain the trails, and make sure that you're enjoying a world-class experience. These fees are only meant, Mr. Speaker, to offset the costs involved with the enforcement and the current rules for enforcement, and for enhancing our public lands. This fee is in no way different than the purpose for collecting the fees for camping in our national or provincial parks. And it remains an affordable option for almost every Albertan. And most importantly, Albertans told us that they would be willing to pay such a fee as this in order to enjoy the outdoors in exchange for the environmental capacity to take care of our environment so that they could enjoy this when they go out into the backcountry. You know, I know that I've had many conversations with the minister. You're not going to shut me down, are you? No. Okay. Thank you for your time, and now maybe get back into this a little later. Thank you.
It's only the clock that would prevent the speaking limits, not the speaker, merely a humble servant of the Assembly. Standing Order 29-2A is available if anyone has a brief question or comment for the member for Drayton Valley Devon. Seeing none, are there others wishing to speak? The honourable member for Edmonton Meadows has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise in the House and add my comments to the Bill 64, Public Lands and Amendment Act 2021. So it's not only problem what this bill is purporting, Mr. Speaker. When I look at the pattern and the debate we had last night on the bills and the work that's being done in the Assembly for past 2 years, what I come to the conclusion is that the government is somehow too much indulged into the right-wing popular ideas, and they're not convinced yet to look at the 2 years at least history if they don't want to go back and check their facts and learn from it. Mr. Speaker, Alberta is going through very unprecedented, challenging times. That we have seen the low oil prices crisis, and that is also raising one question. We were wise enough and worried for the well-being of our province. That was the very time when we need to brainstorm and initiate the thought process, being one of the large oil-producing places around the globe. What have went wrong compared to the countries like Norway? So we could not even suffer a setback for months when the countries depending on similar commodities and economic structure actually saved billions of reserves for the difficult times. So in 2019, we saw that the government was not really, open to learn anything about it. They have the idea, and they moved with that idea. And since then, after implementing their belief that the big corporations, it's the responsibility of the big corporations come in and serve the communities, has not provided anyone. Opposition already didn't believe in that. The government has nothing to be claimed that if those measures, the steps, the actions taken by the government has any way contributed to our province. So as I said, the province is going through the very unprecedented time. More than 250,000 of people unemployed in the province right now. And the whole world is, going through the very historic moments facing the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. So do Albertans. By having lost their jobs and going through stressful time, dealing with strict health orders. And this was the time after a year and a half, we could probably offer something to the public that would not even add a cost. We could encourage the people to get out and experience our beautiful provincial parks that would give them a healthy environment. But the other thing I just wanted to add, I don't know how this government came to the conclusion during this specific time that they thought the province is not in the capacity to maintain its operations the way it's going on for the decades and centuries. So what impact it has created on during the COVID, when more and more people are actually staying home? Was there a rising challenge for the government for the past 1 year? So they came into the conclusion that they need to legislate this user fees onto various Albertans. They need support from our government more than ever. But I think government is, as I said, they're not willing to learn. I was listening to the CBC radio on the way to work, and the former Prime Minister of Canada, John Christian, actually was the host speaking on the radio. He answered the question, how you view this time compared to when you were in the office? He just delivered one message, I was not left and I was not right. When there was a challenge, I always looked both ways. And I never rule out the one side of the idea because of its name. So this is how I try to learn and govern the country. So what I see within this government, that is not the approach. The government is not willing to learn. There's broad experiences around the globe. I know the Premier has actually made trips to countries like India, and he would have got a chance to see the pros and cons, good and bad, and things happening around. But it doesn't seem like he's really actually willing to learn and apply all those experiences here in Alberta. The governments around the globe who have moved toward this idea of imposing everything on the public with the idea of leaving the free market for the super rich corporations, and then the feeling the public and citizens are or should pay for each and every, the public cost, have become disastrous. When I see this, I also see in this bill compared to the government's approach. We have debated that the youth wages rollback that will create youth employment, but instead that actually created the unemployment rate higher in this province among the youths. The government, I see even, I saw on TV, the Premier even tried to blame the opposition party, believing in imposing more taxes on ordinary Albertans. But in fact, the pattern and the work we are seeing and we are experiencing in this House shows the government is not really sparing in any aspect of or the sectors to Albertans. So creeping the bracket, approximately $600 million more in taxes being collected from Albertans. And by not coding inflation and the population growth, the education property taxes will come more in hundreds of millions of dollars to the government. And we were debating the bill that purporting the idea again that the government is not responsible to provide these services to their citizens in municipalities. And what we are seeing in this bill right now is not only proposing new fees at a time when the Albertans needed more help, encouragement from this government, and also the concept, the contrary to what I heard from the government House members. So something that I remember receiving emails from the community members and community organizations. So when the casino funds were established, they wouldn't have probably gone through if the idea behind that was not to focus to help the community organizations, cultural groups, non-profits within the provinces. That was the very argument that convinced people to agree with that idea. And now what had happened, that casino funds have been moved by this government into the general revenue. And the consequences we have seen, loads of emails, complaints, calls from the community organizations, social organizations, So they are not really being able to access those funds they have been in the past. The applications are not being approved. On the contrary, they've been receiving the letters that their organizations will get audit. They have conflict of interest not to use this money in this respect. And same thing what we are seeing here on the name of improving the infrastructure, services, roads. And I will raise this question again, why at this time, but government proposes the fee structure with that very belief that they think the ordinary people should pay for everything. Even when they're struggling with high unemployment rate, struggling with putting actually food on the table for the families, making payments for mortgages. And specifically, I wanted to give a stress on high utility fees. So this concept cannot be supported, Mr. Speaker. So I do not support this bill, and I want to conclude my remarks with this. Thank you.
Just perfectly on time. Well done. Standing Order 29-2A is available. If anyone has a brief question or comment for the member for Edmonton Meadows. Seeing none, are there others wishing to speak to the bill? The member for Edmonton West Henday has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise this afternoon to speak to Bill 64, Public Lands Amendment Act 2020. I appreciate the opportunity, and no doubt as we consider opportunities to get out of the house, of course, as safe as possible and following the health guidelines, this is a conversation that is important in the grand scheme of things to ensuring the sustainability and the protection of our public lands for future generations, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to that matter, and I am also thankful as I continue to listen to the debate this afternoon to all members who have stood and spoke to the importance of opportunities like camping across our province and other leisure activities, and I thank them for that. And of course, I have had that opportunity as well to spend time, most recently, at Pembina Provincial Park, doing some camping there. It's been a while, Mr. Speaker, but that has happened in the past, and I appreciate that those opportunities are here within our province and the beautiful landscapes that Alberta has to offer families. And so while we are considering this legislation and how it will affect the future use of parks and the future costs of public lands, I think, we have to look back at some of the decisions that this UCP government has made up to this point, especially when we talk about the cost that is being considered here in this legislation and how this legislation is going to roll out, and especially once again about how that funding that is collected by the provincial government is going to be used. And I'm thankful to the members who have stood and spoke to the fact that there is no assurances through this legislation that these funds that are being collected through Bill 64 are going to be used specific to things like enforcement of rules and enforcement of this legislation itself. And no assurances from the government that those funds are going to be spent on renewal of these campgrounds or maintenance of these campgrounds. And so when I look at the conversation that has happened online through social media around Bill 64, of course, very early stages of this legislation, there's a lot of concern. And while there's some people who flat out don't support the idea of fees altogether or expanding fees on these lands, there's others who say, well, I might be willing to consider it if we see value for the investment or value for the fees that are being collected. And unfortunately, from what we've seen in the past of this UCP government, it's hard, as I said last evening, for Albertans to take this government and the proposals that are being put forward at face value. When we even were considering a piece of legislation yesterday about increasing costs to 911 services and the importance of upgrading those services, of course, it's a consideration that has to be made, but the fact is, it is going to cost Albertans more to have those services, and there's no assurances, once again, in that instance, that the services will actually be getting better. And in that respect, we've seen that the centralization of those services have gotten worse. We can look to other instances, whether it be changes to general revenue, or changes to the AGLC funds that are collected and how that is being used and put into general revenue instead of opportunities for Albertans to see exactly how that money is being spent, especially when it comes to community groups in our community that often rely on those funds, now have less transparency around how that money is being spent. And so it's I would say, easy to understand why Albertans are concerned, and why, when we look within Bill 64 and the decision that this government has made to not create a dedicated revenue fund where this money would be transparently used, and Albertans would have further assurances that it would be spent on the things that the government is saying it will be spent on, they are rightfully concerned. And so as previous members have asked, and I would pose the same question, whether those options were considered when the discussions around this legislation and the formation of this legislation were happening. Was there options explored by the department and by the ministry that would ensure that the revenues raised were going to only be spent on public lands management? And if that was the case, I think that we would all appreciate if the minister was willing to speak to why exactly through those conversations we don't see that explored or expanded upon here in this legislation. There are questions around limitations, or exactly what the future might be for these fees, if we could see an expansion of further fees past the $30 that is being proposed in here for annual passes, or the $20 per person for a 3-day pass. I imagine that in those considerations through the ministry, that this might just be the beginning of those conversations. And so what can we expect on the horizon that is being enabled through Bill 64, the Public Lands Amendment Act? Those are the questions that I'm hearing from people in the community and discussions online. You know, when I think about some of the work that we did in government, and a member alluded to it earlier from the opposition caucus here, that we spent time in our time in government creating new park systems and protecting environmentally sensitive ones. And what we've seen from this government so far is a willingness to delist them. And further, when we consider the proposals that are being put forward by this government regarding the eastern slopes, I think that Albertans are also rightfully concerned that if you're an Australian private corporation, you can come in and buy hectares of land from this government for the same price or similar prices as some families are going to be charged for 3-day passes or annual passes to use parks that, at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, are already being paid for through their taxes. And the member from Edmonton Northwest alluded to the fact that what we're looking at here is essentially Albertans being double taxed on very important resources within our communities. And so that really goes back to the fact that if this money is being collected, if there's going to be fees imposed on Albertans for accessing this public land, that they need assurances that it is going to be spent in the community that they're paying those fees in, or at the very least, that it's going to be spent to strengthen and enforce legislation and bylaws, and as well as maintain these very important lands across our province. And we need those reassurances, and unfortunately, we are not seeing that through Bill 64. I I once again have to think about, as many members have alluded to at this point this afternoon, the way that we're seeing this government impose fees on Albertans, conversations around fishing license fees, the idea of tolls on bridges across the province, on potentially public infrastructure of all sorts, whether it's highways or other infrastructure in communities. And I'm very concerned because while we take these pieces one at a time and might consider it nickel and diming Albertans, of course the cost is much more than nickel and diming, but these fees add up. They have compounding effects. And so when we talk about fishing licenses, when we talk about potential tolls on infrastructure, when we talk about fees that are being proposed through this legislation, it is becoming a lot more expensive for Albertans to enjoy the nature that we have to offer in our province. And that's very concerning. And of course, Mr. Speaker, it goes much further than that when we consider things like this government's decision to remove insurance caps on Alberta drivers, costing hundreds, if not thousands of dollars extra for Albertans across the province. When we consider the decision from this government to remove utility caps that our government had put in place, Albertans are seeing fees skyrocketing in all instances, and it's very unfortunate that instead of, to some extent, working within the parameters that we have before us in our current budget, this government, for one, is willing to increase fees of all sorts, but two, not willing to be transparent with how those fees are being spent. And it's extremely unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. And it really, once again, goes back to the lack of credibility that this government has when it comes to consultations, when it comes to spending Alberta's money wisely, or at least the perception of that money being spent wisely. Look no further than the $30 million a year war room and the embarrassment that has been on a national, on an international level. And Albertans are rightfully concerned about the decisions and the direction of this government and how their dollars are being spent. And so, once again, while there might be a level of support for something like fees, whether they're these ones or others, the fact is Albertans do not trust that this government is going to reinvest that money in the way that they're saying they're going to, especially with the lack of that detailed in Bill 64. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, people want accountability, and it doesn't seem to be here in this legislation. As other members have spoken about, June 1st is the proposed date for this to come into effect. And so while Albertans are considering how they might explore Alberta through camping potentially, and they are making those plans, of course, once again, following the health guidelines that have been set out by the province, I think that they are in for an awakening when they go to pay for these fees, and there is a jump on those expenses. There is an increase on those expenses. And once again, when we look at how this government has made decisions about how money is being spent in other situations, whether we look at the Ministry of Children's Services, for instance, with hundreds of millions of dollars unspent in that budget, and an unwillingness to ensure that that money is being spent effectively, as far as we can tell, simply to be able to add that back into general revenue, as we're seeing here. No accountability. When we look at community and social services and the administration of the AISH program, we saw this government trying to pull some funny accounting tactics. Not really funny for the people that are trying to access those funds, but accounting tactics to try and make their budget look more balanced than it was. And once again, when we reflect on changes to the AGLC and how money is being funded for important programs across our province within that, within the AGLC, once again, Albertans are not left with much confidence that this government is going to make the right decision, is going to spend the funds how they're saying they're going to, is not going to be transparent about how those funds are being spent. which is very concerning, and at the end of the day seems to be the biggest problem within this piece of legislation. Now, once again, when we look at what's in here, a requirement for public land camping pass for people aged 18 years or older when random camping on public lands in the eastern slopes. And of course, a majority of the random camping that happens in the province are in those areas. And the cost proposal for those camping passes, $20 a day per person for a 3-day pass, or $30 per person for an annual pass. We need to ensure that that money is being reinvested in a way that is sustainable in terms of the enforcement and of the maintenance of these resources and of these public lands. And I also appreciate the comments that have been made from the opposition caucus here in terms of the problematic history that this government has when it comes to consultation on public lands, when it comes to the consultation around our provincial parks. And they saw exactly what happens when you try to bring in legislation or bring in rules without properly consulting and without listening to Albertans. And they received a lot of pushback from that. Probably one of the largest pushbacks that I've seen in this term. One of them, though there's been several, of course, Mr. Speaker, but that was one instance where we saw a major outcry from the public. And while we're thankful that that process was paused, there's always another day for this government to bring that forward again. And so people should continue to be concerned about that process moving forward. Now, no doubt that we must work to protect these lands, and if that includes...
Standing Order 29-2A is available. If anyone has a brief question or comment under Standing Order 29-2A. Seeing none. Anyone else wishing to speak to the bill? The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika is on his feet.
Took me a while, Mr. Speaker, but I got there. It's a long way up. It's a long way up. Air's a little thinner up here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for recognizing me. It's my pleasure to speak briefly on this bill. I just wanted to rise here and tell everybody how much I love the outdoors and getting out there. And during these difficult times, exploring Alberta, I think, is a great option for us, given that we have certain restrictions within our province. And I think it's safe to say that being outdoors, getting that vitamin D from the sun is just a great way to spend our time. Hear, hear. And I'm grateful that we have, I would argue, the most beautiful landscapes in the country. Hear, hear. I often argue that Cardston-Siksika is God's country. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think Alberta in general is God's country. And I think we could all agree with that. And that's why I encourage my fellow Albertans to get out there and enjoy it. And especially now in these difficult times. And I would love to go on and talk about how much I love the outdoors and taking opportunities to enjoy those with my family. But I think now is a great time to adjourn debate. So I move that.
Honourable members, having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika to adjourn debate, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. My opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 66, Public Health Amendment Act 2021. Honourable Mr. Shandro.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise and to move second reading of Bill 66. As you know, the Public Health Amendment Act and Bill 66 outlines the next steps in the Alberta government's plan to modernize the Act and to provide greater transparency during public health emergencies. And the health and safety of all Albertans is and will always be a top priority for Alberta's government. The Public Health Act is one of Alberta's oldest pieces of legislation. The last time it was updated was in 2002, following the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And at that time, the government introduced emergency measures to enable government action in extraordinary circumstances. And the COVID-19 pandemic was the first time in Alberta's history that when these measures were used to declare a state of public health emergency. It was at a time when no one really knew if the government would be able to continue as normal and how we would ensure that vital public health or public services would continue to operate. And that's why Alberta's Legislative Assembly created the Special Select Public Health Act Review Committee with a mandate to review the act. Their role was to determine if the legislation could be improved in light of our experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. And during this review, the committee heard from many Albertans and received hundreds of submissions. And I want to thank all members of the committee for their work to listen to Albertans' concerns and to provide recommendations on how to modernize the Public Health Act. The proposed amendments will reflect current and emerging public health challenges and best practices, and help Alberta's government respond quickly to public health issues, including chronic diseases, and protect the health and safety of Albertans. One of the largest concerns expressed by Albertans during these consultations with the committee was the emergency powers of ministers. Albertans expressed concerns that these ministerial powers that first, as I said, were added to the Act in 2002 in light of the 9/11 attacks, were an overreach. And what we've learned over the last year is that the Assembly is able to adapt to meet safely. The legislature was able to continue to successfully debate, and the government has passed critical legislation to support lives and to support livelihoods through this extraordinary time. Now, these amendments would repeal the provisions that were not only just added in 2002, Mr. Speaker, but also in Bill 10, the Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act. And in fact, all sections under the Act that empower a minister to modify legislation by ministerial order would be repealed. And as I said, this includes repealing the sections that were added in 2002, giving power to a minister to modify enactments. And I want to be clear that while the proposed amendments repeal these authorities, this bill will not affect the current public health measures, nor will it limit our ability to respond effectively to the pandemic. Checks and balances play an important role in balancing protection of public health with individual rights. And many of the proposed amendments in Bill 66 enhance individual rights and create additional safeguards while maintaining the government's ability to respond to public health challenges. For example, Bill 66 would remove the authority of government to mandate immunizations or conscript individuals to support a public health emergency. Albertans told us that this is an extreme authority that infringes on their civil liberties. And Dr. Hinshaw was asked by the Special Select Review Committee when she came before them to provide her evidence if she supported government having the power to mandate vaccines. And she responded by saying the following, and I quote, "I don't see an example of where that would be used. So I think if we have a piece of legislation that we're unlikely to use, I'm not sure it provides much benefit. I'd be comfortable with that particular piece of legislation being removed," end quote. Alberta's government supports Dr. Hinshaw's position, and we're following through on our commitment to repeal that section of the Act. We know that the vast majority of Albertans will voluntarily opt to receive the COVID-19 vaccine when eligible, and I know that I will. Alberta has one of the best vaccine rollouts in the country. I encourage all Albertans to book their shot when it's their turn. Alberta's approach to encourage immunization is focused on education, it's focused on information sharing, and providing data-driven evidence to support Albertans to make their own informed decisions. In addition, Bill 66 clarifies and enhances individual rights in the Act, and this includes the following. First, ensuring that individuals are informed of the location if they are being detained. Second, establishing criteria that must be met before requiring an individual to be treated or examined. And third, establishing criteria for how personal health information is collected or disclosed under the Act. And Albertans are clear that they want transparent information sharing from government when responding to a public health emergency. Bill 66 includes a new requirement to publish orders that apply to the public or if it applies to groups online. That is, that it would publish online orders that apply to groups or the public. This would help increase Albertans' awareness of public health measures and help make sure that they can find information quickly on what measures are in place. And on top of that, as recommended by the review committee, we are making periodic review of the Act a requirement. If passed, the Act would be reviewed every 10 years to ensure that it continues to address the public health needs of Albertans. The recommendations of the Special Select Committee included amending the legislation to better reflect current and emerging public health challenges and practices. And we've taken the recommendations and found additional opportunities to modernize the Public Health Act through this legislation. These changes better reflect the state of the province today and what we've learned through the COVID-19 pandemic, so we are better positioned for the future. And this includes establishing the qualifications of the Chief Medical Officer of Health in the Act, which is in line with other Canadian jurisdictions. The amendments would also clarify that someone under an isolation order is not limited from working from home if they are able. The existing provisions do not take into account the modern ability to work from home. The amendments would update the legislation to clarify that an employee may work from home if isolating and if they are able to do so. The amendments would also add sections to the Act to address chronic diseases and preventable injuries. When the Public Health Act was written, the concerns of public health were focused mostly on communicable diseases. And as we know that the current legislation, the current form of the Public Health Act, Part 3 of communicable diseases, is the most significant part of that act. Now, while keeping Albertans safe from communicable diseases is still important, it's still relevant, especially now that we are in the middle of a pandemic, we know that chronic disease and preventable injuries are growing health concerns. And in fact, chronic disease is the leading cause of death for Albertans and accounts for the largest share of healthcare costs. By adding new sections to strengthen the province's work to prevent chronic disease, this aligns Alberta with other provinces across Canada. And additionally, it gives the Chief Medical Officer of Health the legislative authority to monitor, to report on, and to engage in public health planning related to chronic diseases. And this would be in specific geographical, specific geographical area, or it could be province-wide. And ultimately, by proposing to include chronic disease and preventable injuries to the Public Health Act, we will have the additional tools to provide information and engage in prevention activities to help improve the lives of people living with chronic disease such as diabetes, arthritis, or heart disease. And as part of these modernization amendments and to support government's red tape reduction initiative, we're also proposing to repeal Section 70 and the regulated matter regulation. And this means that Albertans who use inhalants as an intoxicant will no longer be fined for their addiction. These measures are unique in Alberta and are inappropriately punitive for vulnerable Albertans. Alberta's government has made recovery-oriented treatment for people who use substances a priority, and removing these measures will support recovery rather than enforce fines and imprisonment. And in closing, Mr. Speaker, Albertans want, and they deserve, government to strike the right balance between the rights of individuals and the measures needed to protect public health. And Bill 66 would do just that. And I want to thank all of those Albertans who shared their thoughts, who shared their ideas, their feedback, their input on the Public Health Act. Their important feedback shaped the amendments that are proposed in Bill 66. The amendments would also deliver on the commitment that I made in October of 2020 to repeal sections of Bill 10, the Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act. I ask for your support for a second reading of Bill 66, the Public Health Amendment Act. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate. Thank you.
Honourable members, having heard the motion as proposed by the Minister of Health to adjourn debate, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered. The Deputy Government House Leader. perhaps?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that we adjourn till 7:30 this evening.
Honorable members, having heard the motion as proposed by the Deputy Government House Leader to adjourn until 7:30 p.m., all those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. The motion is carried and so ordered. The House stands adjourned until 7:30 p.m.